Welcome, fellow wanderer, to a journey into one of fiction's most disturbed minds. Tonight, we explore the twisted psychology of Eric Theodore Cartman, a 10-year-old boy whose darkness rivals that of history's most notorious figures. This is not just the story of a cartoon character, but an examination of how evil takes root and flourishes. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through the shadows of South Park's most complex creation. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let's begin our descent into the mind of a monster. In the quiet mountain town of South Park, Colorado, on a day that would prove significant to the future of animated television, Eric Theodore Cartman entered the world. His birth, like everything that would follow in his life, was surrounded by mystery, dysfunction, and the kind of chaos that seems to follow certain individuals from their very first breath. The exact date of his arrival remains somewhat ambiguous in the show's continuity, but what we do know is that from the moment he drew breath, Eric Cartman was destined to become something extraordinary in the worst possible way. The circumstances of his birth tell us everything we need to know about the foundation upon which his twisted psyche would be built. Leanne Cartman, his mother, was already well established in her particular lifestyle by the time Eric arrived. Her profession, if we can call it that, had made her something of a local legend in South Park, known to virtually every man in town, in ways that would prove deeply damaging to a developing child's understanding of relationships, love, and basic human decency. But perhaps even more significant than his mother's occupation was the mystery surrounding his paternity. Throughout the series, the question of who Eric's father really is has been a source of ongoing speculation, manipulation, and trauma. Initially, the show teased us with the possibility that his father might be his own mother, a hermaphrodite twist that seemed to explain everything about Eric's warped worldview. Later, this was revealed to be a cover-up, with Jack Tenorman, a former Denver Bronco, being identified as his biological father, a revelation that came with its own horrifying implications given Eric's treatment of Scott Tenorman years earlier. This paternal ambiguity is not merely a running gag or a plot device. It represents something much deeper about Eric's fundamental understanding of identity, belonging, and worth. A child who doesn't know who his father is, who has no stable male figure in his life, and who watches his mother cycle through an endless parade of men, learns very early that relationships are transactional, that love is conditional, and that trust is a luxury he cannot afford. These early lessons would prove to be the cornerstone of everything Eric would become. Leanne Cartman's parenting style, if we can dignify it with such a term, was characterized by what psychologists would recognize as extreme permissiveness coupled with emotional neglect. She gave Eric everything he wanted materially, while providing none of the structure, boundaries, or genuine emotional connection that a developing child desperately needs. This combination is particularly toxic because it teaches a child that they are simultaneously the center of the universe and completely alone in it. From his earliest years, Eric learned that crying, screaming, and manipulation would get him whatever he wanted from his mother. But more importantly, he learned that these tactics worked because his mother was fundamentally weak, desperate for approval, and terrified of conflict. He discovered that adults, the people who were supposed to be authority figures, could be controlled if you understood their weaknesses well enough. This realization would become the foundation of his entire approach to human relationships. The absence of a father figure in Eric's life cannot be overstated in its importance to his psychological development. Without a strong masculine presence to provide structure, discipline, and boundaries, Eric was left to navigate the world with only his mother's permissive chaos as a guide. He learned that authority could be manipulated, that rules were suggestions, and that the key to getting what you wanted was understanding what other people feared most and exploiting those fears mercilessly. But the damage went deeper than simple spoiling or lack of discipline. Eric was exposed to adult sexuality and dysfunction from his earliest years, witnessing his mother's parade of partners and absorbing lessons about human relationships that no child should ever learn. He saw that love was something you performed for money, that intimacy was a commodity to be traded, and that the most important thing about another person was what they could do for you. These early experiences created what psychologists call a foundational attachment disorder. Eric never learned to form genuine emotional connections with other people because he never experienced genuine emotional connection himself. His mother's love, such as it was, came with strings attached and was always conditional on his ability to make her feel good about herself as a parent. He learned to perform affection rather than feel it, to manipulate rather than trust, and to view other people as objects to be used rather than individuals to be respected. The town of South Park itself played a role in Eric's psychological development. This was a community that was simultaneously innocent and corrupt, a place where the most bizarre and disturbing events were treated as normal occurrences. Eric grew up in an environment where alien abductions were routine, where celebrities regularly visited to cause chaos, and where the adults were consistently shown to be incompetent, hypocritical, and easily manipulated. This taught him that the world was fundamentally absurd, that authority was a joke, and that the only rational response to such a reality was to take whatever you could get, however you could get it. The other children in Eric's early life served as his first laboratory for testing and refining his manipulation techniques. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, his supposed best friends, were actually his first victims, though none of them, including Eric himself, understood this at the time. He learned to play them against each other, to exploit their individual weaknesses, and to present himself as whatever they needed him to be in order to get what he wanted from them. Stan's desire to be liked and accepted made him vulnerable to Eric's approval and disapproval. Kyle's strong moral compass made him predictably reactive to Eric's increasingly outrageous behavior. Kenny's poverty made him desperate for any kind of acceptance or inclusion. Eric learned to read these needs and exploit them with a precision that was terrifying in its effectiveness, especially coming from someone so young. His relationship with toys and imaginary friends during this early period reveals another crucial aspect of his psychological development. Unlike normal children, who use play to process emotions and develop empathy, Eric used his toys as practice subjects for manipulation and control. His stuffed animals, particularly Clyde Frog and Polly Precipants, were not comfort objects, but subjects over whom he could exercise absolute authority. This early need for complete control would become a defining characteristic of his personality as he grew older. The first signs of his disturbed psychology emerged gradually, in ways that might have seemed harmless to casual observers, but were actually deeply troubling when viewed in context. His Halloween costume choices, his birthday party demands, his casual cruelty to weaker children like Pip, all of these were early warning signs that something was fundamentally wrong with Eric's emotional development. His relationship with authority figures outside his home revealed the extent to which his mother's permissive parenting had damaged his ability to function in structured environments. Teachers, principals, and other adults who attempted to set boundaries or impose consequences found themselves dealing with a child who simply could not accept that anyone had the right to tell him what to do. He learned to circumvent authority rather than respect it, to find loopholes rather than follow rules, and to view any attempt at discipline as a personal attack to be retaliated against rather than guidance to be accepted. Perhaps most disturbingly, Eric's early years showed clear evidence of his ability to compartmentalize his behavior and present different faces to different people. He could be charming and manipulative with adults when it served his purposes, cruel and domineering with weaker children when he wanted to feel powerful, and falsely vulnerable with his peers when he needed their sympathy or support. This chameleon-like quality, this ability to be whoever he needed to be to get what he wanted, is one of the most chilling aspects of his psychological profile. The environmental factors that contributed to Eric's development extended beyond his immediate family to include the broader cultural context of 1990s and early 2000s America. He was raised during a time of increasing wealth disparity, political polarization, and cultural conflict, absorbing messages about competition, materialism, and the importance of winning at all costs. These broader social influences reinforced the lessons he was learning at home about the transactional nature of human relationships and the fundamental selfishness of human motivation. Television and media played a significant role in shaping Eric's worldview during these formative years. He was exposed to adult content far too early, absorbing lessons about violence, sexuality, and power dynamics that his developing mind was not equipped to process appropriately. This premature exposure to adult themes accelerated his psychological development in some ways while stunting it in others, creating the bizarre combination of sophisticated manipulation skills and childish emotional reactions that would characterize his personality throughout the series. The role of shame in Eric's early development cannot be overlooked. His mother's lifestyle, his unknown paternity, his weight, and his family's dysfunction all combined to create a deep well of shame that he learned to cover with aggression, manipulation, and grandiosity. Rather than learning healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with difficult emotions, he learned to externalize his pain by inflicting it on others, to deflect his own shame by attacking the perceived weaknesses of those around him. By the time Eric reached the age we see him at in the early seasons of South Park, all of these factors had combined to create a child who was fundamentally broken in ways that would prove nearly impossible to repair. He had learned to see other people as objects to be manipulated, rather than individuals to be respected. He had developed a grandiose sense of self that masked a deep well of insecurity and rage. He had internalized the lesson that the only way to get what you wanted in life was to take it, regardless of the cost to others. The tragedy of Eric Cartman's early life is not just that it created a monster, but that it created a monster who was still, fundamentally, a child. All of his manipulation, all of his cruelty, all of his grandiose schemes were ultimately the desperate attempts of a damaged child to feel safe and important in a world that had taught him he was neither. This understanding doesn't excuse his behavior, but it helps explain how someone so young could become something so dark, and it sets the stage for everything that would follow in his psychological evolution. The genesis of Eric Cartman's evil was not a single moment of transformation, but a gradual accumulation of damage, neglect, and twisted lessons about human nature. By understanding these early years, we begin to comprehend not just how a cartoon character was created, but how real-world monsters are born, nurtured, and ultimately unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. The child is father to the man, as the saying goes. And in Eric's case, the child was father to something far worse than a man. He was father to a force of pure, calculated malevolence wrapped in the deceptive package of a 10-year-old boy. To understand Eric Cartman's true genius, we must look beyond his surface-level cruelty and examine the sophisticated psychological machinery that operates beneath his childish exterior. What makes Eric so uniquely terrifying is not simply that he's willing to hurt people, but that he possesses an almost supernatural ability to identify exactly how to hurt them most effectively. His manipulation techniques are so refined, so precisely calibrated to exploit human weakness, that they would be impressive if they weren't so deeply disturbing. Eric's understanding of human psychology operates on multiple levels simultaneously. He reads people not just for what they want, but for what they fear, what they're ashamed of, what they desperately need to believe about themselves, and most importantly, what they're willing to sacrifice to maintain their self-image. This multidimensional analysis happens almost instantaneously when he encounters someone new, like a predator sizing up potential prey, cataloging weaknesses and vulnerabilities for future exploitation. The foundation of Eric's manipulative abilities lies in his complete lack of genuine emotional investment in other people. While this absence of empathy is typically seen as a limitation, in Eric's case, it functions as a superpower. He can observe human behavior with the cold objectivity of a scientist studying lab rats because he doesn't experience the emotional interference that clouds most people's judgment. He sees patterns where others see chaos, opportunities where others see obstacles, and weaknesses where others see strengths. His approach to manipulation follows a consistent methodology that reveals the calculating intelligence behind his seemingly impulsive actions. First, he establishes what his target values most, whether it's social acceptance, moral superiority, financial security, or family relationships. Then, he identifies the contradictions and hypocrisies within that value system, the places where his target's stated beliefs conflict with their actual desires or behaviors. Finally, he creates situations where his target must choose between their stated values and their hidden wants, always positioning himself to benefit regardless of which choice they make. The genius of Eric's manipulation lies not just in his ability to identify these pressure points, but in his understanding of timing and escalation. He rarely goes for the kill shot immediately. Instead, he builds elaborate psychological campaigns that unfold over time, each interaction carefully designed to move his target closer to the position he wants them in. He plants seeds of doubt, nurtures insecurities, and gradually reshapes his victims' understanding of their own motivations until they find themselves doing exactly what he wanted all along, convinced that it was their own idea. His manipulation of Stan demonstrates this process perfectly. Stan's fundamental need to be liked and accepted makes him vulnerable to social pressure, but Eric never exploits this weakness directly. Instead, he creates situations where Stan's desire to maintain his friendships conflicts with his moral instincts, gradually conditioning him to choose social harmony over ethical consistency. Over time, Stan becomes increasingly willing to go along with Eric's schemes, simply to avoid the discomfort of confrontation, even when he knows what Eric is doing is wrong. The way Eric handles Kyle reveals an even more sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. Kyle's strong moral convictions make him seemingly immune to direct pressure, so Eric takes a different approach. He deliberately triggers Kyle's righteousness, provoking him into taking increasingly extreme positions in opposition to whatever Eric claims to believe. By positioning himself as the voice of ignorance and bigotry, Eric manipulates Kyle into becoming his unwitting accomplice, using Kyle's own moral certainty as a weapon against him. Kyle thinks he's fighting Eric, but he's actually dancing to Eric's tune, responding exactly as Eric knew he would. His relationship with Butters showcases perhaps his most disturbing manipulative technique, the exploitation of genuine trust and innocence. Butters' natural goodness and willingness to believe the best of people creates opportunities that Eric exploits with surgical precision. The AWESM-O deception is a masterclass in long-term manipulation, demonstrating Eric's ability to maintain a complex false identity for extended periods while gradually extracting exactly the information he needs to destroy his victim. What makes this particularly chilling is that Eric clearly enjoys the process, taking genuine pleasure in the elaborate nature of his deception. Eric's understanding of group dynamics allows him to manipulate entire communities with remarkable effectiveness. He grasps intuitively that people behave differently in groups than they do individually, that crowd psychology follows predictable patterns, and that fear and anger can be cultivated and directed like crops in a field. His ability to transform a classroom full of children into a mob of gender-hating fanatics, or to convince an entire town to embrace anti-Semitic violence, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of mass psychology that would be remarkable in an adult, let alone a child. The technique he uses most frequently is what psychologists call projection and deflection. When confronted with his own bad behavior, Eric never denies what he's done. Instead, he reframes the situation to make himself the victim, skillfully redirecting attention to his accuser's motivations, while simultaneously positioning himself as misunderstood or unfairly persecuted. This approach is devastatingly effective because it forces his opponents to defend their own actions rather than pursue their original accusations. His use of false vulnerability is particularly sophisticated and deeply manipulative. Eric has learned that appearing weak or damaged can be just as powerful as appearing strong, and he switches between these personas with fluid ease depending on what the situation requires. When he needs sympathy, he becomes the misunderstood fat kid who just wants to be accepted. When he needs authority, he becomes the confident leader with a clear vision. When he needs to avoid consequences, he becomes the confused child who didn't understand the implications of his actions. The way Eric weaponizes other people's morality against them reveals perhaps the darkest aspect of his manipulative genius. He understands that good people are constrained by their own ethical systems in ways that he is not, and he uses this asymmetry as a tactical advantage. He knows that Kyle won't actually hurt him despite countless provocations, that Stan won't abandon their friendship despite being repeatedly betrayed, and that adults won't punish him as severely as his actions deserve because they see him as a child. This understanding allows him to operate with a freedom that his victims can never match. His ability to compartmentalize his manipulations is equally impressive and disturbing. Eric can maintain completely different relationships with the same person, depending on the context and his current needs. He can be Stan's best friend in one scene and his greatest enemy in the next, shifting seamlessly between roles without any apparent internal conflict. This emotional flexibility, this ability to turn his feelings on and off like a light switch, gives him tremendous power over people who experience emotions as permanent and meaningful states. Eric's manipulation of authority figures reveals his sophisticated understanding of adult psychology and institutional dynamics. He grasps that teachers, parents, and other authority figures are constrained by professional obligations and social expectations that he can exploit. He knows that adults want to believe children are fundamentally innocent, that they're reluctant to acknowledge true evil in someone so young, and that they're vulnerable to accusations of unfairness or overreaction. He uses these blind spots ruthlessly, always positioning himself as the misunderstood victim of adult incompetence or bias. The temporal dimension of Eric's manipulation is particularly noteworthy. He doesn't just think tactically about immediate gains, he thinks strategically about long-term positioning. He plants information that won't be useful until months later, maintains relationships that seem pointless until they suddenly become crucial, and creates debts and obligations that he collects at precisely the right moment for maximum impact. This long-term thinking reveals a level of psychological sophistication that borders on the supernatural. His understanding of cognitive bias and logical fallacies is remarkably advanced for someone his age. He instinctively grasps concepts like confirmation bias, sunk cost fallacy, and social proof, using them to guide his victims toward the conclusions he wants them to reach. He creates situations where people feel they've arrived at their decisions independently, never realizing that every step of their reasoning process was carefully orchestrated to lead them exactly where Eric wanted them to go. The way Eric handles resistance to his manipulation reveals another layer of his psychological sophistication. Rather than becoming frustrated or angry when someone sees through his schemes, he adapts his approach, often incorporating their awareness of his manipulation into a more complex manipulation. He turns their skepticism into a weapon against them, using their knowledge of his dishonesty to make them doubt their own perceptions and judgments. His ability to create win-win scenarios for himself is perhaps most impressive of all. Eric rarely puts himself in situations where his failure means genuine loss. Instead, he structures his manipulations so that even when his primary plan fails, he gains something valuable from the process. Information about his targets, social positioning, or simply the satisfaction of causing chaos, Eric always walks away with something useful, even from his apparent defeats. The most chilling aspect of Eric's manipulative abilities is how naturally they come to him. There's no evidence that he studied psychology or learned these techniques from external sources. Instead, they seem to flow from his fundamental nature, as natural to him as breathing. This suggests that his manipulative genius isn't learned behavior but an innate talent, a horrifying gift that makes him uniquely dangerous in ways that traditional education or therapy might not be able to address. His manipulation techniques continue to evolve throughout the series, becoming more sophisticated as he encounters new challenges and more complex social situations. Each failure teaches him something new about human psychology, and each success reinforces patterns that he refines and perfects. He's not just a manipulator, he's a student of manipulation, constantly learning and improving his techniques through practical application. What makes Eric's manipulative abilities so disturbing is not just their effectiveness, but their complete disconnection from any normal human emotional framework. He manipulates people not out of anger or revenge or even greed, but simply because he can. The manipulation itself is the reward. The demonstration of his power over others is its own justification. This makes him uniquely unpredictable and dangerous, because his motivations don't follow normal human patterns that might allow others to anticipate or counter his actions. Understanding Eric's manipulation techniques helps us recognize similar patterns in real-world relationships and situations. His methods, while exaggerated for comedic effect, reflect genuine psychological principles that actual manipulators use to control and exploit others. By examining his fictional techniques in this safe, analytical context, we can better understand and protect ourselves from real-world manipulation, while appreciating the remarkable psychological complexity of this seemingly simple cartoon character. The architecture of Eric's manipulation is built on a foundation of complete emotional detachment, constructed with tools of psychological insight, and operated with the precision of a master craftsman. It represents one of fiction's most sophisticated explorations of how evil thinks, how it operates, and how it presents itself to the world. In the quiet darkness of contemplation, we can marvel at the terrible beauty of this psychological machinery, while remaining safely distant from its actual operation, understanding both its power and its ultimate emptiness. There exists a moment in the Chronicles of South Park that serves as a psychological watershed. A single episode that transformed Eric Cartman from a merely disturbed child into something approaching genuine evil. The episode known as Scott Tenorman Must Die stands as perhaps the most important 22 minutes in the entire series, not just for what it reveals about Eric's capacity for darkness, but for how completely it reshapes our understanding of what he is capable of becoming. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but rather unfolded like a carefully orchestrated descent into moral bankruptcy, each step calculated to bring Eric closer to a point of no return. The story begins with what appears to be a simple teenage prank, the kind of minor humiliation that happens countless times in schools across America every day. Scott Tenorman, a high school student with the typical teenager's sense of superiority over younger kids, encounters Eric at the local convenience store and sees an opportunity for easy entertainment. Scott convinces Eric that purchasing his pubic hair will somehow accelerate Eric's journey into puberty, playing on the deep insecurities that Eric carries about his maturity and social status among his peers. For $16.12, Eric purchases what he believes to be the key to his transformation from child to teenager. The transaction itself reveals so much about Eric's psychological state at this moment in his development. He's desperate to be seen as mature, willing to believe the most absurd claims if they promise to elevate his status, and completely blind to the obvious deception being perpetrated against him. This vulnerability, this moment of genuine childlike naivety, would prove to be the last time we see Eric as anything approaching an innocent victim. When Eric discovers the truth about his purchase, when he realizes that he has been made a fool of by someone he considered beneath his notice, something fundamental shifts in his psychological makeup. The humiliation he experiences is not just about the money or even the deception itself. It's about the revelation that he, Eric Cartman, the self-proclaimed genius manipulator, has been outmaneuvered by what he considers an inferior opponent. This realization strikes at the very core of his grandiose self-image, creating a narcissistic wound so deep that it demands not just revenge, but complete and total destruction of the person who inflicted it. Eric's initial attempts at revenge follow predictable patterns, the kinds of schemes that viewers had come to expect from his character in previous episodes. He tries to embarrass Scott publicly, to turn others against him, to reclaim his money through various transparent deceptions. But Scott, being older and more experienced, easily sees through these childish attempts and turns them back against Eric, deepening the humiliation with each failed scheme. What Eric doesn't understand yet is that each failure is teaching him something crucial about the nature of revenge, about the difference between simple retaliation and complete victory. The repeated humiliations serve as a masterclass in psychological conditioning. Each time Scott outsmarts Eric, each time he's made to look foolish in front of others, Eric learns something new about the inadequacy of conventional revenge. He begins to understand that simply embarrassing Scott or getting his money back won't be enough to repair the damage to his ego. The wound Scott has inflicted goes deeper than simple pride. It strikes at Eric's fundamental sense of who he is and what he's capable of achieving. As Eric's schemes become more elaborate and continue to fail, we begin to see the emergence of a different kind of thinking, a calculating coldness that hasn't appeared in his character before. The childish anger and frustration give way to something much more dangerous, a patient fury that begins to contemplate solutions that exist far beyond the normal boundaries of childhood conflict. Eric starts to think not just about winning, but about what total victory would actually require. The turning point comes when Eric realizes that Scott's greatest vulnerability isn't his reputation or his social standing, but his love for his family. This insight reveals a level of psychological sophistication that's genuinely frightening in someone so young. Eric understands that the deepest wounds aren't inflicted on the ego or the wallet, but on the heart, and that the most devastating revenge targets not what someone has, but what they love most. This realization marks the moment when Eric crosses the line from troubled child to something approaching a genuine psychopath. The plan that Eric ultimately devises is so elaborate, so completely disproportionate to the original offense, that it suggests a fundamental disconnection from normal human emotional responses. He doesn't just want to hurt Scott, he wants to destroy him completely, to inflict a level of psychological damage that will be permanent and irreversible. The complexity of the scheme reveals Eric's growing understanding of long-term strategic thinking, his ability to coordinate multiple moving pieces over an extended period, and most disturbingly, his willingness to involve innocent people in his revenge fantasy. Eric's manipulation of Scott's parents demonstrates a level of coldness that's genuinely shocking. He approaches them not as potential victims deserving of sympathy or consideration, but as resources to be exploited in service of his larger goal. The ease with which he deceives them, the way he plays on their parental concern and community spirit, reveals how completely he has abandoned any normal moral framework. There's no hesitation, no moment of doubt about involving adults in what should be a conflict between children. The partnership Eric forms with the Denkins family, Scott's neighbors, shows his growing sophistication in building alliances and using other people's grievances to serve his own purposes. He doesn't need to convince the Denkins to help him out of friendship or loyalty. He simply needs to align their existing hatred of Scott's family with his own revenge fantasies. This understanding of how to weaponize other people's emotions without revealing his own ultimate intentions demonstrates a level of manipulative skill that's genuinely disturbing. The actual execution of Eric's plan reveals the full extent of his transformation. The care with which he orchestrates every detail, the way he manages information flow to ensure that Scott remains unaware of the danger until it's too late, the cold calculation with which he manipulates both the victims and the perpetrators, all of this shows a mind that has moved far beyond normal childhood thinking into something approaching genuine evil genius. What makes the plan so particularly horrifying is not just its ultimate outcome, but the way Eric savors every moment of its execution. He takes visible pleasure, not just in Scott's eventual suffering, but in the process of orchestrating that suffering. The manipulation itself becomes a source of satisfaction, a demonstration of his power and superiority that feeds his damaged ego in ways that simple revenge never could. The revelation of Eric's plan unfolds with the inexorable logic of a classical tragedy. Scott, believing himself to be the victim of a simple theft involving his favorite band Radiohead, remains completely unaware of the true scope of what's happening around him. Eric's ability to keep Scott focused on relatively minor concerns, while orchestrating something infinitely more devastating, shows a sophisticated understanding of misdirection and psychological manipulation. When the truth finally emerges, when Scott discovers what has really happened to his parents, the moment serves as a revelation not just for Scott, but for the audience. We realize that we have been watching the birth of a monster, the transformation of a character we thought we understood into something completely alien to normal human experience. Eric's reaction to Scott's horror and grief reveals the complete absence of empathy, remorse, or any normal human emotional response to another person's suffering. The chili, that innocent-seeming bowl of comfort food, becomes one of the most disturbing images in television history because of what it represents. It's not just about the physical act of cannibalism, though that's horrifying enough. It's about the psychological cruelty of making someone unknowingly participate in the destruction of what they love most. Eric has forced Scott to literally consume his own parents, to take their deaths into his body in the most intimate way possible. Eric's demeanor during the revelation scene is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire episode. There's no anger, no excitement, no loss of control. Instead, there's a calm satisfaction, a quiet pride in his own cleverness that's infinitely more disturbing than any display of rage could be. He's not just hurting Scott, he's demonstrating his own superiority, proving to himself and to the world that he is capable of achieving anything he sets his mind to, regardless of moral boundaries. The presence of Radiohead at this moment of ultimate revelation serves multiple narrative functions. On one level, they represent the normalcy that Scott thought he was fighting for, the simple teenage pleasure that seemed worth defending. On another level, they serve as witnesses to Eric's transformation, their horror and disgust reflecting the audience's own reaction to what they're seeing unfold. Their tears, falling in response to what they recognize as a genuinely beautiful moment of revenge, validate Eric's achievement in terms that he understands and values. The aftermath of the revelation shows Eric completely unmoved by Scott's breakdown, utterly indifferent to the psychological destruction he has wrought. He's achieved his goal, proven his superiority, and demonstrated his capacity for revenge, and that's all that matters to him. The human cost of his actions is literally meaningless to him, relevant only insofar as it serves as evidence of his own power and cleverness. This transformation doesn't just affect Eric's relationship with Scott, it fundamentally alters his relationship with everyone around him. His friends, who have witnessed his capacity for this level of calculated cruelty, can never look at him the same way again. The audience, who may have found his previous antics amusing or harmless, must now confront the reality of what he has become. The show itself shifts from comedy to something approaching horror, though it maintains its comedic surface to make the horror bearable. The episode serves as a psychological case study in how ordinary selfishness and childish cruelty can evolve into something approaching genuine evil under the right circumstances. Eric's transformation isn't supernatural or inexplicable. It follows a clear psychological progression from wounded narcissism through calculated revenge to complete moral abandonment. Each step in this progression feels logical and inevitable, which makes the final outcome all the more disturbing. The long-term implications of Eric's transformation extend far beyond this single episode. Having crossed this line, having proven to himself that he's capable of literally anything in pursuit of his goals, Eric becomes a fundamentally different character. The constraints that govern normal human behavior no longer apply to him because he has demonstrated that they are simply obstacles to be overcome rather than genuine moral boundaries. The Scott Tenorman episode stands as a masterpiece of character development precisely because it makes Eric's transformation feel both shocking and inevitable. We can trace every step of his journey from victim to monster, understanding exactly how each humiliation and failure contributed to his ultimate moral collapse. This understanding makes him more terrifying, not less, because it suggests that such transformations are possible for anyone under the right circumstances. In the quiet aftermath of this psychological earthquake, as we contemplate the magnitude of Eric's transformation, we're left with disturbing questions about the nature of evil itself. Is Eric a monster because he was born that way? Or did the circumstances of his humiliation and revenge create the monster? The episode suggests that the answer might be both, that certain individuals possess the capacity for such transformation, but require specific triggers to unlock their darkest potentials. The Scott Tenorman transformation remains Eric's defining moment, the psychological watershed that separated his past from his future and established him as one of fiction's most genuinely disturbing characters. In understanding this transformation, we gain insight not just into a cartoon character, but into the psychological mechanisms that can turn ordinary selfishness into extraordinary evil, and the thin line that separates difficult children from genuine monsters. At the heart of Eric Cartman's psychological dysfunction lies one of the most toxic and codependent relationships ever portrayed in fiction. The bond between Eric and his mother Leanne represents a masterclass in how well-intentioned but fundamentally flawed parenting can create and nurture genuine evil. Their relationship is a study in mutual manipulation, emotional neglect disguised as love, and the catastrophic consequences of a parent who mistakes enabling for affection. To understand Eric's capacity for darkness, we must first understand the woman who shaped him, the dynamics that govern their interactions, and the profound damage that their codependency has inflicted on both of them. Leanne Cartman exists as a walking contradiction, a woman whose surface-level kindness masks a deep well of selfishness and emotional immaturity. She presents herself to the world as a loving, devoted mother who would do anything for her son. And in many ways, this perception contains a grain of truth. She does love Eric in her own limited way, but her love is fundamentally selfish, designed more to meet her own emotional needs than to provide the structure and guidance that Eric desperately requires. This confusion between love and enabling forms the foundation of their dysfunctional relationship and creates the conditions under which Eric's worst impulses are not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. The most immediately obvious aspect of Leanne's parenting style is her complete inability to set or maintain boundaries. From Eric's earliest years, she has responded to his demands not with the firm guidance that children need, but with immediate capitulation designed to avoid conflict and maintain the illusion of harmony in their household. When Eric throws tantrums, she gives him what he wants. When he makes unreasonable demands, she finds ways to meet them. When he behaves cruelly toward others, she either ignores it entirely or offers weak, ineffective corrections that Eric learns to dismiss without consequences. This pattern of behavior teaches Eric several devastating lessons about human nature and his place in the world. First, he learns that authority figures are fundamentally weak and can be controlled through the application of emotional pressure. Second, he discovers that his needs and desires are more important than anyone else's, including his mother's, because the world consistently reorganizes itself around his demands. Third, he internalizes the belief that love is demonstrated through capitulation and that anyone who truly cares about him will sacrifice their own needs to meet his wants. Leanne's inability to parent effectively stems from her own deep-seated emotional needs and psychological limitations. She craves approval and validation so desperately that she's willing to sacrifice her parental authority to maintain Eric's affection. She experiences his anger or disappointment as devastating personal failures, leading her to avoid any action that might result in his temporary unhappiness, even when such actions would be in his long-term best interests. This emotional fragility makes her completely unsuited to provide the kind of consistent, firm guidance that a child like Eric requires. The dynamics of their relationship reveal themselves most clearly in moments of conflict, those rare instances when Leanne attempts to assert some form of parental authority only to immediately retreat when faced with Eric's resistance. These moments follow a predictable pattern. Leanne makes a tentative attempt to set a boundary or impose a consequence. Eric responds with escalating emotional manipulation, and Leanne quickly abandons her position to restore peace. Each time this cycle repeats, Eric learns more about how to control his mother, while Leanne becomes more convinced that maintaining harmony is more important than maintaining authority. Eric's manipulation of his mother operates on multiple sophisticated levels simultaneously. On the surface, he uses straightforward emotional blackmail, threatening to withdraw his love or approval if she doesn't give him what he wants. But beneath this obvious manipulation lies a more complex psychological dynamic. Eric has learned to present his demands not as selfish desires but as genuine needs, convincing Leanne that denying him would constitute genuine cruelty or neglect. He frames his wants as medical necessities, social requirements, or educational opportunities, making Leanne feel that she would be failing as a mother if she refused. The way Eric weaponizes Leanne's guilt reveals his sophisticated understanding of her psychological vulnerabilities. He knows that she feels inadequate as a parent, ashamed of her lifestyle choices, and desperate to prove her worth through her devotion to him. He exploits these insecurities ruthlessly, making her feel responsible for his unhappiness and convincing her that the only way to demonstrate her love is through complete submission to his will. This emotional terrorism is so subtle and gradual that Leanne often doesn't recognize it as manipulation, instead experiencing it as evidence of their close and loving relationship. Leanne's own lifestyle and personal choices create additional complications in their relationship that Eric learns to exploit with devastating effectiveness. Her profession and the revolving door of men in their home create an environment of moral confusion where traditional boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate behavior become blurred. Eric grows up witnessing his mother's interactions with countless partners, absorbing lessons about relationships, sexuality, and human nature that profoundly distort his understanding of normal human connections. The financial dynamics of their relationship further complicate the psychological landscape of their home. Leanne's income allows her to provide Eric with material comforts and luxuries that serve as substitutes for genuine emotional connection and proper parenting. She buys him expensive toys, takes him on elaborate vacations, and indulges his every material whim, mistaking these gestures for love, while failing to provide the structure, discipline, and emotional security that he actually needs. Eric learns to equate love with material provision and develops an expectation that people who care about him will demonstrate that care through financial sacrifice. The absence of other stable adult figures in Eric's life makes his relationship with Leanne even more psychologically significant. Without a father figure to provide alternative models of authority and relationship dynamics, Eric's understanding of human interaction is filtered entirely through his experiences with his mother. He learns that adults are weak and manipulable, that authority is negotiable, and that the key to getting what you want is understanding what the other person needs to believe about themselves. These lessons, learned in the context of his relationship with Leanne, become the foundation for all of his future interactions with authority figures and peers. The most disturbing aspect of their relationship is how Eric's growing capacity for evil feeds back into the dynamic between them. As Eric becomes more manipulative and cruel in his dealings with the outside world, he brings these same techniques home, using them against the woman who created the conditions for their development. Leanne finds herself increasingly unable to distinguish between Eric's genuine needs and his manipulative demands, leading her to enable behaviors that become progressively more extreme and disturbing. The few occasions when Leanne attempts to seek help in managing Eric's behavior reveal the depth of her own denial and the extent to which she has internalized his manipulation. When professionals suggest that Eric's behavior is abnormal or concerning, Leanne typically responds with defensiveness and rationalization, unable to accept that her parenting might be contributing to his problems. She presents Eric's worst behaviors as signs of intelligence or creativity, reframing his cruelty as misunderstood brilliance and his manipulation as evidence of his special nature. The episode featuring Caesar Millen, the dog whisperer, provides one of the clearest examinations of their dysfunctional dynamic. and the rare glimpse of what might be possible if Liane could find the strength to change her approach. When Cesar treats Eric like a misbehaving pet rather than a troubled child, implementing firm boundaries and consistent consequences, Eric's behavior improves dramatically. For a brief moment, we see what Eric might have become with proper guidance and structure from the beginning of his life. However, the ultimate failure of this intervention reveals the fundamental tragedy of their relationship. Liane's own emotional needs prove too powerful to overcome, and she chooses to return to their dysfunctional patterns rather than maintain the difficult but effective boundaries that Cesar established. This choice demonstrates that her enabling of Eric serves her own psychological needs as much as his, that their codependency is truly mutual, and that change would require her to confront her own limitations and failures as a parent. The way their relationship evolves throughout the series shows how codependency deepens and becomes more entrenched over time. As Eric grows older and his manipulative abilities become more sophisticated, Liane becomes increasingly dependent on his approval and validation. She begins to see herself not as his parent but as his partner, or even his subordinate, allowing him to make decisions that should rightfully be hers, and deferring to his judgment in situations where she should be providing guidance. Eric's treatment of his mother in public settings reveals another layer of their dysfunctional dynamic. He alternates between presenting her as a devoted parent when it serves his purposes and humiliating her when he needs to demonstrate his power over her. Liane tolerates this treatment because she has learned to interpret any attention from Eric as evidence of their special bond, unable to distinguish between love and abuse because her own emotional needs blind her to the reality of their relationship. The impact of their relationship extends far beyond their own household, affecting everyone who comes into contact with them. Eric's teachers, his friends' parents, and other community members find themselves dealing with the consequences of Liane's parenting failures while being unable to address the root cause of Eric's behavior. This creates a ripple effect of dysfunction that spreads throughout South Park, as Eric's unchecked behavior creates problems that other adults must somehow manage or contain. The financial costs of Liane's enabling behavior become increasingly evident as the series progresses. She spends enormous sums on Eric's schemes, demands, and desires, often going into debt or making significant sacrifices to fund his latest project or whim. This financial enabling teaches Eric that money is simply another tool for getting what he wants, and that other people's financial limitations are obstacles to be overcome rather than boundaries to be respected. Perhaps most tragically, their codependent relationship prevents both Eric and Liane from developing the kinds of healthy relationships they might have with other people. Eric's expectation that everyone should cater to his needs the way his mother does makes him incapable of forming genuine friendships or romantic connections. Liane's emotional investment in Eric's approval makes her unable to pursue her own relationships or interests, trapping her in a cycle of dependency that serves neither of their long-term interests. The rare moments when their relationship shows cracks, when the mutual manipulation becomes too obvious to ignore, or when the costs become too high to bear, provide glimpses into what both of them might have become under different circumstances. These moments suggest that Liane is capable of being a better parent, and that Eric might have been capable of being a better person, but they also demonstrate how deeply entrenched their patterns have become, and how difficult it would be for either of them to change. The ultimate tragedy of Eric and Liane's relationship lies not just in what it has made Eric become, but in what it has prevented him from becoming. Under different circumstances, with proper boundaries and genuine love instead of enabling and emotional manipulation, Eric's intelligence and charisma might have developed into positive qualities that benefited both him and society. Instead, those same qualities have been twisted into tools for exploitation and cruelty, shaped by a relationship that mistake indulgence for love and manipulation for affection. In the complex tapestry of Eric Cartman's psychological makeup, no relationship burns as intensely or reveals as much about his fundamental nature as his eternal conflict with Kyle Broflovsky. Their dynamic transcends simple childhood rivalry, evolving into something approaching a cosmic struggle between opposing forces of human nature. Kyle represents everything that Eric cannot be, everything that he secretly fears he should be, and everything that his twisted worldview demands he destroy. To understand Eric's capacity for hatred, his sophisticated methods of psychological warfare, and the depths of his moral corruption, we must examine this relationship that has become the defining conflict of his existence. Kyle Broflovsky enters Eric's world as an unwitting catalyst for his darkest impulses. Where Eric is selfish, Kyle is altruistic. Where Eric is manipulative, Kyle is honest. Where Eric embraces moral relativism, Kyle clings to absolute principles. This fundamental opposition creates a psychological tension that Eric finds simultaneously intolerable and irresistible. Kyle's very existence serves as a constant reminder of Eric's own moral failures, a living mirror that reflects back all of his worst qualities, while demonstrating that another path is possible. The origins of Eric's anti-Semitism appear to be rooted not in any coherent ideological framework, but in his pathological need to diminish Kyle's moral authority. Kyle's Jewish identity provides Eric with a convenient target for his hatred, a socially recognizable form of bigotry that allows him to express his personal animosity toward Kyle in terms that seem to transcend their individual conflict. By attacking Kyle's religion and ethnicity, Eric transforms their personal rivalry into something that feels larger and more significant, elevating his petty jealousy into what he perceives as a cosmic struggle. Eric's anti-Semitic rhetoric follows patterns that reveal more about his psychological needs than any genuine political or religious conviction. His hatred is performative rather than ideological, designed to hurt Kyle specifically rather than to advance any broader agenda. He adopts the language and symbols of historical anti-Semitism, not because he understands or believes in their underlying premises, but because he recognizes their power to inflict psychological damage on his target. This instrumental use of bigotry makes his behavior perhaps even more disturbing than genuine ideological hatred, because it reveals a mind capable of weaponizing humanity's darkest impulses for purely personal gain. The sophistication of Eric's psychological warfare against Kyle demonstrates his deep understanding of his opponent's character and motivations. Eric recognizes that Kyle's greatest strength, his unwavering moral conviction, is also his greatest vulnerability. Kyle's need to do the right thing, to stand up for justice and defend the innocent, creates predictable patterns of behavior that Eric learns to exploit with devastating effectiveness. By positioning himself as the voice of ignorance and hatred, Eric ensures that Kyle will feel compelled to oppose him, drawing his victim into conflicts where Eric controls the terms of engagement. Eric's manipulation of Kyle operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, he engages in obvious provocations designed to trigger Kyle's righteous anger and make him appear unstable or unreasonable to outside observers. But beneath this obvious antagonism lies a more subtle psychological campaign designed to gradually erode Kyle's confidence in his own moral judgment. Eric plants seeds of doubt about Kyle's motivations, questions the consistency of his principles, and creates situations where Kyle's attempts to do good result in unintended harm. The way Eric escalates their conflicts reveals his understanding of psychological conditioning and his patience in pursuing long-term goals. He doesn't simply attack Kyle directly, which would be too obvious and might generate sympathy for his victim. Instead, he creates elaborate scenarios where Kyle's own moral convictions lead him into increasingly extreme positions. Eric knows that Kyle will feel compelled to oppose whatever position Eric takes, so he deliberately adopts stances that will force Kyle to defend increasingly untenable ground. One of Eric's most effective techniques is his ability to make Kyle complicit in his own victimization. By creating situations where Kyle must choose between his principles and his practical interests, Eric forces his victim to either compromise his values or suffer the consequences of moral consistency. When Kyle chooses principle over pragmatism, Eric uses the resulting difficulties to demonstrate the futility of moral behavior. When Kyle compromises his principles, Eric uses this as evidence of Kyle's hypocrisy and moral weakness. The temporal dimension of Eric's campaign against Kyle reveals his sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. He doesn't seek immediate victories that might provide Kyle with clear evidence of his malicious intent. Instead, he pursues gradual erosion of Kyle's confidence and social standing, creating cumulative psychological pressure that builds over time. Each individual incident might seem relatively minor, but the combined effect is devastating to Kyle's sense of self and his relationships with others. Eric's use of Kyle's family against him demonstrates the depths of his willingness to inflict collateral damage in pursuit of his goals. He understands that Kyle's love for his family, particularly his mother and younger brother, creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. By involving Kyle's relatives in their conflicts, either as targets or as weapons, Eric ensures that Kyle cannot simply walk away from their rivalry without abandoning people he cares about. The way Eric weaponizes Kyle's Jewish identity extends far beyond simple name-calling or stereotyping. Eric studies Jewish history and culture not to develop genuine understanding, but to identify pressure points and vulnerabilities that he can exploit. He learns enough about anti-Semitic tropes and historical persecution to craft attacks that strike at Kyle's deepest fears and insecurities about his place in the world and his family's safety. Eric's ability to turn Kyle's virtues into weapons against him represents perhaps his most sophisticated psychological technique. Kyle's compassion becomes a tool for manipulation when Eric presents himself as a victim deserving of sympathy. Kyle's sense of justice becomes a source of frustration when Eric creates situations where no clear moral path exists. Kyle's loyalty to his friends becomes a burden when Eric forces him to choose between competing loyalties. The public nature of many of their conflicts serves Eric's purposes by creating an audience for Kyle's humiliation, and by establishing a narrative framework that positions their rivalry as entertainment rather than genuine harassment. By making their conflicts into a kind of public performance, Eric normalizes his abuse of Kyle and makes it difficult for adults or other children to intervene effectively. The audience becomes complicit in Kyle's victimization by treating serious psychological warfare as amusing childhood drama. Eric's understanding of Kyle's relationship with their mutual friends allows him to isolate his victim and manipulate the social dynamics of their peer group. He recognizes that Stan's loyalty to Kyle is genuine but not unlimited, that Kenny's friendship is conditional on social acceptance, and that other children will generally side with whoever seems to be winning their ongoing conflict. This social intelligence allows Eric to gradually erode Kyle's support network while building his own influence within their community. The way Eric responds to Kyle's attempts at reconciliation reveals the truly pathological nature of their relationship. When Kyle tries to end their conflict through compromise or peace offerings, Eric typically interprets these gestures as signs of weakness rather than opportunities for genuine resolution. He uses Kyle's desire for peace as leverage to extract additional concessions, creating a pattern where every attempt at reconciliation actually strengthens Eric's position while weakening Kyle's. Eric's exploitation of adult authority figures in his campaign against Kyle demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics and his ability to manipulate systems designed to protect children. He learns to present his conflicts with Kyle in ways that make himself appear to be the victim of Kyle's aggression, using adults' natural protective instincts against Kyle while avoiding consequences for his own behavior. The psychological toll of Eric's campaign becomes evident in Kyle's changing behavior and relationships over time. The constant stress of dealing with Eric's attacks affects Kyle's academic performance, his friendships, and his relationship with his family. The cumulative effect of years of psychological warfare leaves Kyle increasingly isolated, defensive, and prone to emotional outbursts that Eric then uses as evidence of Kyle's instability. Eric's ability to make Kyle question his own perceptions and memories represents one of his most disturbing psychological techniques. Through subtle gaslighting and reality distortion, Eric creates situations where Kyle begins to doubt his own experiences and interpretations of events. This psychological manipulation is particularly effective because it targets Kyle's greatest strength, his rational mind, and turns it against him. The way Eric uses Kyle's moral consistency against him reveals his deep understanding of ethical philosophy and psychological manipulation. Eric creates moral dilemmas, where any choice Kyle makes can be used against him, forcing his victim into no-win scenarios where moral action becomes impossible. This technique gradually erodes Kyle's confidence in his own moral judgment and makes him increasingly susceptible to Eric's influence. The occasional moments when Eric and Kyle appear to cooperate or show mutual respect serve Eric's long-term purposes by preventing Kyle from completely disengaging from their relationship. These brief respites from conflict give Kyle hope that genuine friendship might be possible, while also making Eric's subsequent betrayals more devastating. The cycle of conflict and reconciliation creates an addictive dynamic that keeps Kyle emotionally invested in their relationship despite its obvious toxicity. Eric's understanding of Kyle's deepest fears and insecurities allows him to craft attacks that strike at the very core of Kyle's identity and self-worth. He learns what Kyle values most about himself and systematically attacks those qualities, creating doubt where there should be confidence and shame where there should be pride. This psychological precision makes Eric's attacks far more devastating than random cruelty would be. The way their conflict evolves over time shows Eric's ability to adapt his methods to Kyle's developing defenses and changing circumstances. As Kyle becomes more aware of Eric's manipulation techniques, Eric develops new approaches that account for this awareness. The arms race between Eric's psychological warfare and Kyle's defensive strategies creates an escalating spiral of conflict that draws both characters deeper into their dysfunctional dynamic. The broader impact of Eric's treatment of Kyle extends beyond their individual relationship to affect the entire social fabric of South Park. Their conflict serves as a kind of organizing principle around which other relationships and conflicts develop, creating a community-wide dynamic of tension and division that reflects and amplifies their personal animosity. Eric's exploitation of historical anti-Semitism in his attacks on Kyle represents more than just personal cruelty. It reflects his understanding that individual hatred can be amplified and legitimized through connection to broader social prejudices. By linking his personal animosity to historical patterns of persecution, Eric transforms his petty jealousy into something that feels socially sanctioned and culturally significant. The ultimate tragedy of Eric and Kyle's relationship lies not just in the damage it inflicts on both participants, but in its demonstration of how individual pathology can tap into and exploit broader social pathologies. Eric's anti-Semitism may be instrumental rather than ideological, but its effects are no less real for being psychologically rather than politically motivated. Through this twisted relationship, we see how personal evil can connect with and amplify historical patterns of hatred, creating new forms of harm that draw their power from both individual malice and collective prejudice. In the quiet contemplation of this eternal rivalry, we witness one of fiction's most complex explorations of hatred, jealousy, and the ways that individual pathology can weaponize social prejudice for personal ends. The relationship between Eric and Kyle serves as both a character study and a social commentary, revealing uncomfortable truths about how evil operates in both personal relationships and broader social contexts, and how the two levels of harm can reinforce and amplify each other in ways that transcend their individual components. In the pantheon of Eric Cartman's victims, no relationship reveals the true depths of his cruelty, quite like his interactions with Leopold Butters Stotch, where his conflicts with Kyle are fueled by jealousy and ideological hatred. His treatment of Butters represents something far more disturbing: the systematic exploitation of innocence by someone who understands exactly how precious and fragile that innocence truly is. Butters embodies everything that Eric has lost, or perhaps never possessed: genuine kindness, unconditional trust, and an unwavering belief in the fundamental goodness of other people. This makes him not just a target for Eric's manipulation, but a kind of psychological laboratory where Eric can experiment with the limits of human cruelty. Butters enters Eric's orbit as the perfect victim, a child whose natural goodness and trusting nature make him incapable of recognizing the predatory intentions of those around him. His parents have raised him to be polite, obedient, and deferential to authority, creating a psychological profile that Eric recognizes as infinitely exploitable. Butters believes what people tell him, follows instructions without question, and interprets even obvious deception as misunderstanding rather than malice. These qualities, which should be protected and nurtured in any healthy social environment, become weapons that Eric turns against their possessor with devastating effectiveness. The fundamental asymmetry of their relationship cannot be overstated. Where Eric approaches every interaction with calculated self-interest and strategic thinking, Butters responds with genuine emotion and authentic care for others. This creates a dynamic where Eric holds all the power, possesses all the information, and controls all the terms of engagement, while Butters remains perpetually vulnerable, confused, and unable to understand why his attempts at friendship and kindness are met with betrayal and abuse. Eric's exploitation of Butters follows patterns that reveal his sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and his complete absence of moral restraint. He doesn't simply lie to Butters or trick him into doing embarrassing things. Instead, he creates elaborate psychological scenarios designed to maximize Butters' confusion, self-doubt, and emotional distress. The goal isn't just to get what Eric wants, but to demonstrate his complete power over someone who should be his peer and friend. The Awesemo deception represents perhaps the pinnacle of Eric's psychological cruelty, a masterpiece of manipulation that reveals the full extent of his capacity for sustained, calculated abuse. The scheme begins with Eric recognizing an opportunity to exploit Butters' loneliness and desire for companionship. Rather than simply lying to Butters directly, Eric creates an elaborate alternate identity as a robot companion, allowing him to manipulate Butters while maintaining complete deniability and avoiding any risk of genuine emotional connection. The brilliance of the Awesemo deception lies not just in its complexity, but in how perfectly it exploits Butters' specific psychological vulnerabilities. Butters craves acceptance and friendship, but has learned to expect disappointment and betrayal from human relationships. The robot persona allows Eric to offer Butters the unconditional acceptance he desperately needs, while ensuring that this acceptance remains completely artificial and ultimately harmful. Butters opens his heart to what he believes is a safe, non-judgmental companion, never realizing that he's actually confessing his deepest secrets and vulnerabilities to his greatest tormentor. Eric's ability to maintain the AWESM-O deception over an extended period demonstrates his remarkable capacity for sustained psychological manipulation. He must constantly monitor his behavior, speech patterns, and responses to maintain the illusion, while simultaneously gathering information that he can use against Butters later. This requires a level of emotional control and strategic thinking that would be impressive if it weren't so completely devoted to causing harm to an innocent person. The information that Eric gathers during the AWESM-O deception reveals the true extent of Butters' vulnerability and the depth of Eric's betrayal. Butters shares his most embarrassing secrets, his deepest fears, and his genuine affection for his supposed robot friend, creating a treasure trove of ammunition that Eric can use to humiliate and control him indefinitely. The trust that Butters places in AWESM-O makes his eventual betrayal infinitely more devastating than any simple lie or trick could be. The psychological impact of the AWESM-O revelation on Butters cannot be overstated. The discovery that his trusted robot companion was actually Eric in disguise doesn't just expose him to humiliation and blackmail, it fundamentally undermines his ability to trust his own perceptions and judgments. If he could be so completely deceived about something so important, how can he trust anything he believes about the people around him? This erosion of basic trust represents a form of psychological damage that may never fully heal. Eric's treatment of Butters extends far beyond elaborate deceptions to include routine exploitation of his helpful nature and desire to please others. He regularly manipulates Butters into participating in schemes that result in Butters facing consequences while Eric escapes responsibility. This pattern teaches Butters that trying to help others leads to punishment, gradually eroding his natural altruism and replacing it with confusion and self-doubt. The way Eric uses Butters as a scapegoat reveals another dimension of his psychological cruelty. When Eric's schemes go wrong, or when he needs someone to blame for his actions, Butters becomes the convenient target. His natural submissiveness and reluctance to defend himself, making him the perfect fall guy. This pattern reinforces Butters' learned helplessness while allowing Eric to avoid consequences for his increasingly destructive behavior. Eric's manipulation of Butters often involves exploiting his relationship with his parents, particularly his father's strict and often unreasonable demands. Eric understands that Butters lives in constant fear of disappointing his parents and facing their harsh punishments. By creating situations where Butters must choose between obeying Eric and avoiding parental wrath, Eric ensures that Butters remains trapped in cycles of compliance and victimization. The financial exploitation that Eric practices against Butters demonstrates his understanding that economic vulnerability can be used as a tool of psychological control. He regularly tricks Butters into spending his allowance on Eric's schemes, lending him money that will never be repaid, or working for Eric without fair compensation. These economic manipulations create practical dependence, while reinforcing Butters' sense that his needs and resources are less important than Eric's wants and desires. Eric's ability to isolate Butters from potential sources of support reveals his sophisticated understanding of how abusive relationships are maintained and perpetuated. He systematically undermines Butters' relationships with other children, portraying them as unreliable or hostile, while positioning himself as Butters' only true friend and protector. This isolation makes Butters increasingly dependent on Eric's approval and less likely to seek help from others when Eric's treatment becomes obviously abusive. The sexual exploitation and inappropriate exposure that Eric subjects Butters to represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their relationship. Eric regularly involves Butters in sexually inappropriate situations, exposes him to adult content, and uses his innocence about sexuality as a source of entertainment and manipulation. These experiences create confusion and shame that Butters lacks the emotional framework to process, potentially causing long-term psychological damage that extends far beyond their childhood interactions. Eric's use of Butters in his various schemes and businesses reveals how he views his victim as a disposable resource rather than a human being deserving of respect and consideration. Whether he's using Butters as unpaid labor in his enterprises, as a test subject for his experiments, or as a prop in his elaborate revenge fantasies, Eric consistently treats Butters as an object to be used rather than a person to be valued. The way Eric responds to Butters' genuine affection and loyalty demonstrates the complete absence of reciprocal feeling in their relationship. When Butters expresses care, concern, or friendship toward Eric, these gestures are met not with gratitude or reciprocation, but with increased manipulation and exploitation. Eric interprets Butters' kindness as weakness and his loyalty as stupidity, using these positive qualities as leverage for further abuse. The psychological conditioning that Eric practices on Butters follows classic patterns of emotional abuse, alternating between periods of relative kindness and episodes of severe mistreatment. This unpredictable pattern keeps Butters constantly off balance, never knowing what to expect and always hoping that the next interaction might return to the brief moments of apparent friendship. This intermittent reinforcement creates a powerful psychological dependency that becomes increasingly difficult for Butters to break. Eric's exploitation of Butters' religious faith and moral convictions represents another layer of his psychological cruelty. He regularly puts Butters in positions where following his moral principles conflicts with avoiding Eric's displeasure, creating internal conflicts that cause genuine spiritual and emotional distress. By weaponizing Butters' own goodness against him, Eric ensures that his victim cannot find refuge even in his deepest beliefs and values. The impact of Eric's treatment extends beyond Butters himself to affect his relationships with family members, teachers, and other authority figures. Eric's schemes regularly result in Butters facing punishment or disappointment from adults who don't understand the true dynamics of their relationship. This pattern reinforces Butters' sense of isolation, while protecting Eric from adult intervention that might curtail his abusive behavior. The way Eric uses Butters' mistakes and failures against him reveals his understanding of how shame and guilt can be weaponized to maintain control over others. When Butters makes innocent errors or faces normal childhood disappointments, Eric amplifies these experiences, convincing Butters that his failures are evidence of fundamental inadequacy that only Eric's continued guidance can address. The physical dangers that Eric regularly exposes Butters to demonstrate his complete disregard for his victim's safety and well-being. From dangerous stunts to exposure to harmful substances, Eric consistently puts Butters at risk while convincing him that these dangers are normal, fun, or necessary. This pattern normalizes risk and teaches Butters to discount his own safety instincts in favor of Eric's demands. Eric's manipulation of Butters' natural creativity and imagination represents a particularly cruel form of psychological exploitation. He takes Butters' innocent ideas and fantasies and twists them into schemes that serve Eric's purposes while exposing Butters to ridicule and consequences. This corruption of creativity teaches Butters to distrust his own imagination and spontaneity, replacing natural childhood wonder with calculated self-censorship. The long-term psychological effects of Eric's treatment become evident in Butters' changing behavior and personality over time. The innocent, trusting child gradually becomes more anxious, self-doubting, and prone to emotional breakdowns as the cumulative weight of psychological abuse takes its toll. These changes represent not just temporary distress, but potential lifelong damage to Butter's ability to form healthy relationships and trust his own judgment. The community's failure to recognize and address Eric's abuse of Butters reveals broader patterns of how psychological manipulation can operate under the radar of adult supervision. Because Eric's cruelty is primarily emotional and psychological rather than physical, and because Butters has been conditioned not to complain or seek help, their relationship appears normal to casual observers, while continuing to cause severe damage. Eric's treatment of Butters serves as a microcosm of how predatory individuals exploit the innocent and vulnerable in broader society. The patterns of manipulation, isolation, exploitation, and psychological conditioning that characterize their relationship reflect real-world dynamics of abuse, while remaining safely contained within the fictional framework of animated comedy. The ultimate tragedy of Eric's relationship with Butters lies not just in the immediate harm it causes, but in its demonstration of how goodness and innocence can be systematically destroyed through calculated cruelty. Butters represents what Eric might have been under different circumstances, and Eric's treatment of him reflects his own self-hatred, projected outward onto someone who embodies the qualities he has lost or rejected in himself. In the gentle darkness of contemplation, we can see in Eric's treatment of Butters a disturbing mirror of how evil operates in the real world, how it targets the innocent and vulnerable, and how it systematically destroys the very qualities that make human society possible. The relationship between predator and victim, between calculating cruelty and trusting innocence, reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the responsibility we all bear to protect those who cannot protect themselves from the monsters that walk among us. In the complex landscape of Eric Cartman's psychological development, few elements reveal the depths of his manipulative genius, quite like his relationship with religion, authority, and the moral frameworks that govern human society. Eric's approach to Christianity and organized religion represents not genuine faith or spiritual seeking, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how moral authority can be weaponized for personal gain. His interactions with religious concepts, figures, and institutions demonstrate his remarkable ability to identify and exploit the psychological needs that drive human spiritual behavior, transforming sacred concepts into tools for manipulation and control. Eric's initial encounters with Christianity appear to follow the typical patterns of childhood religious education, but closer examination reveals that even his earliest interactions with faith are filtered through his fundamentally transactional worldview. He doesn't approach religion as a source of moral guidance or spiritual comfort, but as a system of rewards and punishments that can be gamed through proper understanding of its rules and loopholes. This instrumental approach to faith becomes the foundation for increasingly sophisticated manipulations that exploit both individual believers and religious institutions themselves. The development of Eric's religious manipulation techniques begins with his recognition that adults, particularly authority figures, are deeply invested in the idea that children can be guided toward moral behavior through proper religious instruction. This creates opportunities for Eric to present himself as a reformed or enlightened individual whenever such a persona serves his immediate needs. He learns to speak the language of repentance and spiritual growth with convincing sincerity, using religious terminology to mask his continued pursuit of selfish goals. Eric's understanding of Christian theology, while superficial in many ways, demonstrates his remarkable ability to absorb and repurpose complex ideas for his own ends. He grasps that Christianity promises forgiveness for sincere repentance, eternal rewards for proper behavior, and divine justice for moral violations. Rather than being inspired by these concepts to actual moral improvement, Eric sees them as exploitable weaknesses in the belief system, ways to manipulate both divine and human authority through strategic performances of faith. The formation of his Christian rock band Faith Plus One represents perhaps Eric's most elaborate exploitation of religious authority for personal gain. The scheme reveals his sophisticated understanding of how spiritual sincerity can be performed and marketed, how genuine religious feeling can be manufactured and commodified, and how the Christian community's desire to support moral entertainment creates market opportunities for those willing to exploit their faith. The band's success demonstrates Eric's ability to identify and serve genuine spiritual needs while remaining completely disconnected from the values he appears to champion. Eric's lyrics and performances with Faith Plus One showcase his remarkable talent for mimicking the language and emotional patterns of genuine religious experience. He crafts songs that speak to real spiritual longings, while containing no authentic spiritual content, creating a kind of theological placebo that satisfies listeners' needs without requiring any genuine commitment or understanding from their creator. This ability to manufacture convincing spiritual content reveals the depths of his psychological sophistication and his complete disconnection from normal human emotional responses. The way Eric handles the commercial and promotional aspects of his Christian rock career demonstrates his understanding of how religious communities function as both spiritual and social organizations. He recognizes that Christian audiences are hungry for entertainment that reflects their values, that they're willing to overlook artistic limitations if the message aligns with their beliefs, and that religious authority figures can be convinced to endorse products that appear to serve their spiritual mission. This institutional understanding allows Eric to navigate religious hierarchies and gain powerful allies who unknowingly support his entirely secular agenda. Eric's interactions with Jesus Christ himself, during the character's various appearances in South Park, reveal his ability to maintain his manipulative persona, even when confronted with ultimate spiritual authority. Rather than being awed or transformed by encounters with divinity, Eric treats Jesus as another authority figure to be managed and manipulated. He approaches Christ with the same calculated charm he uses on teachers and parents, demonstrating his complete inability to recognize or respond to genuine spiritual presence. The theological implications of Eric's behavior during his religious phases reveal his fundamental misunderstanding of Christian concepts like grace, redemption, and moral transformation. He treats salvation as a transaction rather than a relationship, forgiveness as a reset button rather than a call to change, and divine love as conditional approval rather than unconditional acceptance. These distortions allow him to participate in religious activities while remaining completely unchanged by their intended spiritual impact. Eric's use of religious authority to justify his secular ambitions demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of how moral frameworks can be co-opted to serve immoral ends. He learns to present his desires for wealth, fame, and power as divinely inspired missions, his cruel treatment of others as necessary discipline, and his manipulative behavior as strategic evangelism. This ability to reframe selfish actions in spiritual terms reveals his remarkable talent for self-deception and his skill at convincing others to accept obviously false narratives. The way Eric handles criticism of his religious authenticity reveals his understanding of how spiritual communities police themselves and maintain their boundaries. When challenged about his sincerity or theological correctness, Eric responds not with genuine reflection or correction, but with strategic displays of humility and renewed commitment that deflect criticism while maintaining his position within the religious community. He learns to use the Christian emphasis on forgiveness and second chances as shields against accountability for his continued bad behavior. Eric's exploitation of religious ritual and ceremony demonstrates his recognition of how symbolic actions can be invested with emotional and social significance that exceeds their literal content. He participates in baptisms, confirmations, and other religious rites not as expressions of faith, but as performances designed to convince observers of his spiritual transformation. These ceremonial manipulations reveal his understanding of how communities use ritual to mark and celebrate individual change, and how these expectations can be exploited by those willing to perform transformation without experiencing it. The relationship between Eric's religious performances and his continued secular behavior reveals the compartmentalization that allows him to maintain contradictory personas simultaneously. He can deliver sincere-sounding testimony about God's love while planning cruel revenge against his enemies, write moving songs about spiritual transformation while remaining completely unchanged in his personal relationships, and serve as a youth religious leader while continuing to lie, cheat, and manipulate those around him. This psychological flexibility allows him to access the benefits of religious community membership without accepting any of its behavioral constraints. Eric's understanding of religious psychology extends to his recognition of how faith serves different emotional and social functions for different individuals. He learns to identify whether someone uses religion primarily for comfort, community, moral guidance, or social status, then tailors his religious persona to appeal to their specific spiritual needs. This targeted approach to religious manipulation allows him to build alliances with diverse believers while maintaining his flexibility to abandon religious identity whenever it becomes inconvenient. The way Eric handles religious conflict and theological disagreement demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of how doctrinal disputes can be used to divide and weaken religious communities. Rather than engaging seriously with theological questions, he learns to identify and exploit existing divisions within religious groups, positioning himself as a voice of reason or orthodoxy, depending on which stance serves his immediate needs. This approach allows him to gain influence within religious hierarchies while avoiding genuine engagement with spiritual questions. Eric's treatment of religious texts and teachings reveals his remarkable ability to extract useful information while remaining completely unmoved by their intended spiritual impact. He studies scripture not for guidance or inspiration, but for ammunition, learning to quote biblical passages selectively to support whatever position serves his current agenda. This instrumental approach to religious literature demonstrates his complete disconnection from the transformative power that these texts are meant to possess. The financial aspects of Eric's religious enterprises reveal his understanding of how spiritual authority can be monetized and how religious communities can be exploited for economic gain. From his Christian rock band to various religiously themed business ventures, Eric consistently demonstrates his ability to identify and serve spiritual markets while remaining motivated entirely by material rather than spiritual concerns. This commercialization of faith reveals his sophisticated understanding of how genuine spiritual needs create economic opportunities for those willing to exploit them. Eric's manipulation of religious guilt and moral anxiety demonstrates his recognition of how spiritual communities often inadvertently create psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. He learns to identify individuals who struggle with religious scrupulosity or moral perfectionism, then positions himself as someone who can help them achieve spiritual peace through following his guidance. This pastoral manipulation represents one of his most disturbing techniques because it exploits people's genuine desire for spiritual growth and moral improvement. The way Eric uses religious language to reframe his conflicts with others reveals his understanding of how spiritual frameworks can be used to transform personal disputes into cosmic struggles between good and evil. He learns to present his enemies as forces of darkness, his schemes as divine missions, and his failures as tests of faith that strengthen his resolve. This theological reframing allows him to maintain his grandiose self-image while avoiding responsibility for the consequences of his actions. Eric's relationship with religious authority figures demonstrates his ability to identify and exploit the psychological needs of spiritual leaders themselves. He recognizes that pastors, priests, and other religious authorities often struggle with loneliness, doubt, and the burden of maintaining spiritual facades while dealing with very human problems. By presenting himself as a genuinely transformed young person, Eric provides these leaders with evidence that their ministry is effective, creating emotional dependencies that he can exploit for protection and advancement. The long-term consequences of Eric's religious manipulations extend beyond his immediate gains to include the damage he inflicts on genuine believers who encounter his performances. His convincing portrayals of faith, followed by obvious moral failures, create cynicism and doubt in religious communities, making it harder for others to trust expressions of faith and spiritual transformation. This collateral damage reveals how individual manipulation can undermine broader social institutions and cultural values. Eric's ability to abandon religious identity as quickly as he adopts it demonstrates the complete superficiality of his engagement with spiritual concepts. When religious persona no longer serves his needs, he discards it without apparent internal conflict or lingering attachment, moving on to other manipulative strategies, as if his period of religious performance never happened. This emotional detachment from roles he has played convincingly reveals the depths of his psychological disconnection from normal human experience. The theological questions raised by Eric's religious behavior touch on fundamental issues of faith, authenticity, and the relationship between belief and behavior in spiritual communities. His ability to participate convincingly in religious activities while remaining completely unchanged by their intended spiritual impact challenges assumptions about how faith operates and what indicators can be trusted as evidence of genuine spiritual transformation. In the quiet contemplation of Eric's relationship with religion and authority, we encounter disturbing questions about the nature of faith itself and the vulnerability of spiritual communities to exploitation by those who understand their psychological dynamics without sharing their genuine commitments. His religious manipulations serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of mistaking performance for transformation and the responsibility of spiritual communities to develop discernment that can distinguish between genuine faith and sophisticated manipulation. In the grand theatre of Eric Cartman's psychological development, no aspect reveals the true scope of his criminal genius, quite like his elaborate schemes and business ventures. These enterprises, ranging from the seemingly innocent to the genuinely disturbing, demonstrate not just his capacity for deception and manipulation, but his sophisticated understanding of human psychology, market dynamics, and the fundamental weaknesses that drive people to make decisions against their own best interests. Each scheme represents a masterclass in applied criminal psychology, revealing layers of planning, execution, and adaptation that would be impressive if they weren't so completely devoted to exploitation and harm. The foundation of Eric's criminal thinking rests on his early recognition that most people operate according to predictable patterns of desire, fear, and self-deception. Unlike normal children who might engage in small deceptions to avoid punishment or gain minor advantages, Eric approaches dishonesty as a comprehensive worldview, a fundamental assumption that reality is whatever you can convince others to believe. This philosophical foundation allows him to construct elaborate alternate realities that serve his purposes while appearing perfectly reasonable to those who lack his cynical perspective. Eric's business model, though he would never articulate it in such terms, follows the classic structure of identifying unmet needs, creating artificial scarcity, and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of his target market. Whether he's selling weight loss programs to overweight children or manufacturing religious music for Christian audiences, Eric demonstrates an intuitive understanding of how to position himself as the solution to problems that his customers may not have realized they had until he brought them to their attention. The sophistication of Eric's schemes becomes evident when we examine his approach to market research and customer psychology. He doesn't simply guess what people want. He studies their behavior, listens to their complaints, and identifies the gaps between their stated values and their actual desires. This research phase, though informal, reveals a level of strategic thinking that many legitimate businesses fail to achieve, combined with a complete absence of ethical constraints that allows him to exploit his discoveries without moral hesitation. The underpants gnome business model, though presented as a joke within the show, actually reflects Eric's intuitive understanding of how many successful enterprises operate through phases of development that may not be immediately profitable but build toward long-term gains. Phase 1 involves collecting resources or establishing market position. Phase 2 remains mysterious or flexible depending on circumstances, and Phase 3 represents the ultimate profit or benefit that justifies the entire enterprise. This framework appears repeatedly in Eric's schemes, though his Phase 2 often involves psychological manipulation rather than legitimate business development. Eric's venture into the music industry with his Christian rock band Faith Plus One demonstrates his remarkable ability to identify underserved markets and create products that meet genuine consumer needs while serving his own entirely different agenda. The Christian music market represents a perfect target for Eric's approach, because it combines strong consumer demand with relatively low artistic standards and powerful emotional investment from the audience. By understanding what Christian listeners actually want from their music, Eric creates content that serves their needs while generating the fame and financial success he desires. The marketing strategy behind Faith Plus One reveals Eric's sophisticated understanding of how religious communities function as both spiritual and commercial ecosystems. He recognizes that Christian audiences are eager to support artists who appear to share their values, that religious media outlets are hungry for content that aligns with their mission, and that church communities can serve as powerful distribution networks for properly positioned products. This institutional understanding allows Eric to leverage existing religious infrastructure to promote his entirely secular agenda. Eric's approach to intellectual property and creative development demonstrates his recognition that original content creation is less important than effective packaging and distribution of ideas that already resonate with target audiences. Rather than struggling to develop genuinely innovative music, he adapts existing love songs by replacing romantic language with religious terminology, creating familiar emotional experiences wrapped in spiritually acceptable packaging. This technique reveals his understanding that consumers often prefer comfortable familiarity to genuine innovation. The Casa Bonita kidnapping scheme represents perhaps Eric's most elaborate and psychologically complex criminal enterprise, combining elements of fraud, kidnapping, and psychological manipulation into a single coordinated campaign designed to achieve what appears to be a simple goal: eating dinner at his favorite restaurant. The disproportion between means and ends in this scheme reveals the extent to which Eric's criminal thinking has evolved beyond simple cause and effect into elaborate psychological theater where the planning and execution become as important as the ultimate objective. The psychological preparation required for the Casa Bonita scheme demonstrates Eric's growing sophistication in long-term planning and risk assessment. He must consider not just how to achieve his immediate goal, but how to manage the various stakeholders involved, how to maintain operational security throughout the extended timeline, and how to position himself to avoid serious consequences when the truth inevitably emerges. This level of criminal planning reveals a mind that has moved far beyond childish mischief into genuinely sophisticated criminal thinking. Eric's manipulation of Butters throughout the Casa Bonita scheme showcases his refined understanding of how to maintain psychological control over victims who might otherwise expose his operations. He doesn't simply threaten or coerce Butters into compliance. He creates an elaborate psychological framework that makes Butters complicit in his own victimization, while believing that he's helping his friend achieve a reasonable goal. This psychological conditioning ensures that Butters remains cooperative even when the scheme becomes obviously harmful to his own interests. The logistics of maintaining Butters in captivity while continuing to participate in normal social activities reveals Eric's growing competence in operational security and compartmentalization. He must manage multiple concurrent deceptions, maintain his normal social relationships while conducting criminal activities, and adapt his plans as unexpected complications arise. This multitasking ability demonstrates a level of cognitive sophistication that would be remarkable in any context, even one not devoted to criminal enterprise. Eric's handling of adult authority figures during his various schemes reveals his sophisticated understanding of how institutional hierarchies function and where their blind spots can be exploited. He learns to present himself as a responsible, creative young person whose entrepreneurial activities deserve adult support and encouragement. This persona allows him to operate with adult blessing, or at least tolerance, even when his activities would be obviously problematic if their true nature were understood. The financial structures underlying Eric's business ventures demonstrate his intuitive grasp of basic economic principles and his ability to create value propositions that appeal to different stakeholders for different reasons. Whether he's selling weight loss products that exploit body image insecurities, or religious music that serves spiritual needs, Eric understands how to position his offerings to maximize perceived value while minimizing actual costs and commitments on his part. Eric's approach to competition and market positioning reveals his understanding that success often depends more on eliminating rivals than on improving products or services. Rather than trying to outcompete legitimate businesses through superior offerings, Eric focuses on undermining competitors through sabotage, character assassination, and market manipulation. This zero-sum approach to business reflects his broader worldview that treats all human interactions as conflicts where one person's gain necessarily comes at another's expense. The evolution of Eric's criminal enterprises over time shows his ability to learn from both successes and failures, incorporating new techniques and abandoning approaches that prove ineffective or too risky. Each scheme builds on knowledge gained from previous ventures, creating a learning curve that makes his operations increasingly sophisticated and difficult to detect or counter. This adaptive capacity represents one of his most dangerous qualities because it ensures that his criminal abilities continue to develop rather than remaining static. Eric's manipulation of Mel Gibson during his brief foray into political activism demonstrates his recognition that even established authority figures can be influenced and controlled through proper understanding of their psychological vulnerabilities. Rather than being intimidated by Gibson's fame and success, Eric identifies the actor's particular obsessions and insecurities, then creates situations where Gibson's own psychology works against his better judgment. This ability to manipulate powerful adults reveals the extent to which Eric's skills have developed beyond simple childhood deception. The mass psychology elements of Eric's larger schemes reveal his sophisticated understanding of how groups make decisions and how individual psychology changes in crowd settings. Whether he's inciting anti-Semitic violence or promoting religious music, Eric demonstrates his ability to identify and exploit the psychological differences between individual and collective decision-making. This crowd psychology expertise allows him to achieve results that would be impossible through one-on-one manipulation alone. Eric's use of technology and media in his schemes shows his recognition that modern criminal enterprises require sophisticated communication and information management capabilities. He learns to leverage social media, traditional media, and technological tools to amplify his influence and coordinate complex operations involving multiple participants and moving parts. This technological sophistication allows him to operate at scales that would have been impossible for criminals of previous generations. The international dimensions of some of Eric's schemes reveal his understanding that modern criminal enterprises must be able to operate across jurisdictional and cultural boundaries. Whether he's dealing with foreign business partners or exploiting international legal differences, Eric demonstrates a global perspective that reflects his recognition that local limitations can often be overcome through strategic expansion of operational scope. Eric's approach to crisis management and damage control shows his understanding that successful criminal enterprises must be prepared to adapt quickly when operations are exposed or when unexpected complications arise. Rather than panicking when schemes unravel, Eric typically has contingency plans that allow him to minimize losses while positioning himself for future opportunities. This resilience and adaptability make his criminal activities particularly difficult to disrupt through conventional intervention. The psychological impact of Eric's schemes on his victims extends far beyond immediate financial or material losses to include long-term damage to their ability to trust others and make sound judgments about risk and opportunity. By exploiting people's genuine needs and desires, Eric creates associations between hope and betrayal that can affect his victims' future relationships and decision-making capabilities. This collateral psychological damage represents perhaps the most serious consequence of his criminal activities. The institutional consequences of Eric's schemes reveal how individual criminal activity can undermine broader social trust and cooperation. When Eric exploits religious communities, educational institutions, or business networks, he damages not just his immediate victims, but the social structures that depend on basic levels of honesty and good faith dealing. This systemic impact multiplies the harm caused by his individual actions and creates long-term costs that extend far beyond his immediate sphere of operation. Eric's relationship with law enforcement and legal consequences reveals his sophisticated understanding of how criminal justice systems actually operate versus how they're supposed to function in theory. He learns to exploit the reluctance of adults to treat children as serious criminals, the institutional biases that favor young people from middle-class families, and the practical limitations that prevent thorough investigation of seemingly minor offenses. This legal sophistication allows him to operate with impunity, even when his activities clearly cross criminal boundaries. The ultimate tragedy of Eric's criminal genius lies not just in the immediate harm it causes, but in its demonstration of how remarkable intellectual and psychological gifts can be completely divorced from moral development. His schemes represent wasted potential on a massive scale, showing how someone with his analytical abilities and strategic thinking could contribute positively to society if his talents were channeled toward constructive rather than destructive ends. In the quiet contemplation of Eric's criminal enterprises, we encounter disturbing questions about the relationship between intelligence and morality, the vulnerability of social institutions to exploitation by those who understand their weaknesses, and the responsibility of communities to identify and address criminal behavior before it escalates to truly dangerous levels. His schemes serve as case studies in applied criminal psychology while remaining safely contained within fictional boundaries that allow us to examine their techniques without experiencing their harmful consequences. In the vast darkness of Eric Cartman's psychological landscape, there exist rare moments that pierce through the shadows like stars in a moonless sky, brief glimpses of something that might once have been human warmth or could perhaps still become genuine emotion. These fragments of apparent humanity, scattered throughout his development like archaeological remains of a different person, present the most disturbing aspect of his character, precisely because they suggest that beneath the calculated cruelty and manipulative genius lies something recognizably childlike and vulnerable. These moments force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil itself and whether redemption remains possible, even for those who seem to have abandoned all connection to normal human feeling. The most consistent thread of apparent genuine emotion in Eric's character appears in his relationship with his stuffed animals, particularly Clyde Frog and Polly Precipants. Unlike his interactions with human beings, which are characterized by calculation and strategic thinking, Eric's attachment to these inanimate objects seems to bypass his normal psychological defenses and connect with something deeper and more authentic. When his toys are threatened or damaged, his distress appears genuine rather than performed, suggesting that these objects serve as repositories for emotional capacities that he cannot safely express in human relationships. The intensity of Eric's grief when his stuffed animals are destroyed in the episode 19 reveals layers of psychological complexity that his usual behavior patterns tend to obscure. His reaction goes far beyond simple attachment to material possessions, instead suggesting that these toys represent something crucial to his psychological stability and sense of self. The depth of his emotional investment in objects that cannot betray, manipulate, or disappoint him reveals the extent to which his human relationships have failed to provide the basic emotional security that healthy development requires. The way Eric cares for his stuffed animals demonstrates capacities for nurturing and protection that seem completely absent from his treatment of actual living beings. He creates elaborate scenarios and adventures for his toys, speaks to them with apparent affection, and shows concern for their well-being in ways that suggest he retains some understanding of what caring relationships should look like. This contrast between his treatment of inanimate objects and living beings reveals the profound damage that has occurred in his ability to form genuine emotional connections with other people. Eric's relationship with his toys also reveals his deep need for control and predictability in emotional relationships. Unlike human beings, who have their own needs, desires, and reactions that cannot be completely controlled, stuffed animals provide the perfect relationship partners for someone who cannot tolerate the uncertainty and vulnerability that genuine emotional connection requires. They offer unconditional acceptance without demanding reciprocal consideration, love without the risk of rejection, and companionship without the complexity of actual social interaction. The few occasions when Eric shows apparent concern for his mother's well-being provide another window into his buried capacity for genuine emotion. When Leanne faces serious health threats, or when their relationship is genuinely endangered, Eric's responses sometimes seem to transcend his usual manipulative calculations and touch something that resembles authentic fear and love. These moments are particularly significant because they suggest that his fundamental attachment to his mother despite all the dysfunction and manipulation that characterizes their relationship, retains elements of genuine emotional connection. The complexity of Eric's reaction to his mother's potential death reveals the psychological binds that characterize their codependent relationship. His apparent distress seems to combine genuine fear of abandonment with practical concerns about losing his primary source of support and validation. This mixture of authentic emotion and calculated self-interest makes it difficult to determine where genuine feeling ends and strategic manipulation begins, reflecting the overall confusion that characterizes their psychological dynamic. Eric's brief expressions of vulnerability during moments of genuine failure or rejection provide glimpses of the damaged child that exists beneath his grandiose exterior. When his schemes collapse completely, when his friends genuinely turn against him, or when he faces consequences that his usual manipulation techniques cannot circumvent, his facade sometimes cracks to reveal something that resembles normal childhood distress. These moments are fleeting and typically followed by renewed efforts at control and manipulation, but they suggest that his psychological armor is not completely impenetrable. The way Eric responds to genuine kindness from others, particularly when it comes from unexpected sources, sometimes reveals capacity for surprise and even gratitude that seems to bypass his normal defensive mechanisms. When people treat him well despite his reputation or behavior, his responses occasionally contain elements that appear authentic rather than calculated, suggesting that his cynical worldview has not completely eliminated his ability to be moved by unexpected generosity or acceptance. Eric's interactions with animals, particularly cats during the episode Major Boobage, demonstrate his capacity for protective behavior toward vulnerable beings who cannot threaten his psychological defenses. His willingness to risk legal consequences to shelter cats from persecution reveals a moral instinct that seems genuine rather than strategic. The fact that he extends this protection to beings who cannot reciprocate or even acknowledge his efforts suggests that his capacity for altruistic behavior, while deeply buried, has not been completely extinguished. The religious experiences that Eric occasionally appears to have, distinct from his calculated exploitation of religious communities, sometimes seem to connect with something resembling genuine spiritual longing or confusion. His questions about meaning, purpose, and moral responsibility, when they emerge outside the context of manipulation or performance, suggest that he retains some awareness of the spiritual and ethical dimensions that his behavior typically ignores or violates. Eric's rare expressions of genuine remorse or self-awareness, though often fleeting and followed by renewed justification or deflection, indicate that his capacity for moral reflection has not been completely destroyed. These moments of apparent insight into his own behavior and its consequences suggest that somewhere beneath his psychological defenses lies an understanding of right and wrong that his actions consistently violate but cannot completely eliminate. The complexity of Eric's emotional responses during moments of genuine physical danger reveals that his self-preservation instincts remain connected to something resembling normal human fear and vulnerability. When faced with threats that his manipulation skills cannot address, his responses sometimes seem authentically childlike rather than strategically calculated, suggesting that his psychological development, while severely distorted, retains some connection to normal developmental patterns. Eric's occasional displays of what appears to be genuine pride in others' accomplishments, particularly when those accomplishments do not threaten his own interests or status, suggests that his capacity for positive emotion toward other people has not been completely eliminated. These moments are rare and often complicated by subsequent manipulation or exploitation, but they indicate that his emotional range includes possibilities beyond jealousy, hatred, and calculated self-interest. The way Eric sometimes responds to genuine expressions of friendship or loyalty from others reveals his deep confusion about what authentic relationships should look like, and his hunger for connections that transcend the transactional patterns that characterize most of his interactions. When others treat him as a genuine friend rather than a source of entertainment or a problem to be managed, his responses sometimes contain elements of surprise and gratitude that seem to come from a deeper emotional level than his usual strategic calculations. Eric's moments of apparent loneliness and isolation, when his usual social manipulations fail to provide the companionship and validation he craves, sometimes reveal the profound emotional emptiness that his grandiose behavior is designed to conceal. These glimpses of existential despair suggest that his psychological defenses, while effective at protecting him from immediate emotional pain, have created a deeper form of suffering that no amount of control or manipulation can truly address. The occasional emergence of what appears to be genuine curiosity or wonder in Eric's responses to new experiences or ideas suggests that his intellectual and emotional development retains some capacity for growth and change. When he encounters concepts or situations that genuinely surprise him, his responses sometimes seem to engage with possibilities beyond immediate self-interest, indicating that his psychological rigidity is not complete. Eric's complex reactions to the few individuals who seem capable of seeing through his manipulations while still treating him with basic human dignity reveal his deep ambivalence about being truly known and understood. His responses to such treatment combine apparent gratitude with defensive hostility, suggesting that part of him craves authentic connection, while another part fears the vulnerability that such connection would require. The way Eric sometimes appears to struggle with the consequences of his own actions, particularly when those consequences affect people he has some genuine attachment to, indicates that his capacity for empathy and moral reasoning, while severely impaired, has not been completely eliminated. These moments of apparent internal conflict suggest that his psychological development remains capable of generating moral emotions, even if his behavioral patterns consistently override such feelings. The significance of these moments of apparent humanity lies not in their frequency or consistency, but in their very existence within a psychological profile that seems otherwise devoid of normal emotional development. They suggest that Eric's transformation into something approaching a genuine sociopath is not complete, that somewhere within his damaged psyche remain fragments of the person he might have been under different circumstances. However, the ultimate tragedy of these glimpses of humanity is how quickly and completely they are typically overwhelmed by Eric's return to manipulative and destructive patterns. Each moment of apparent vulnerability or genuine emotion is usually followed by renewed efforts to control his environment and exploit those around him, suggesting that while his capacity for normal human feeling may not be completely dead, it is too weak and intermittent to significantly influence his behavior or development. The question of whether these moments represent genuine emotional responses or simply more sophisticated forms of manipulation remains one of the most disturbing aspects of Eric's character. His ability to perform emotion so convincingly in service of his goals makes it nearly impossible to determine when his apparent feelings are authentic and when they are simply tools in more complex psychological campaigns. In the gentle darkness of our contemplation, these fragments of apparent humanity serve as reminders of both the possibility and the tragedy of Eric's psychological development. They suggest that even the most damaged individuals retain some connection to normal human experience, while demonstrating how completely such connections can be overwhelmed by psychological patterns that serve immediate self-interest, at the expense of authentic emotional development and genuine human connection. As the years have passed since Eric Cartman first graced our screens with his particular brand of calculated chaos, his character has undergone a fascinating evolution. that reveals both the consistency of his core psychological patterns and his remarkable ability to adapt to changing social and cultural landscapes. The modern Eric represents not a fundamental transformation of his essential nature, but rather a sophisticated refinement of his manipulative techniques and an expansion of his understanding of how power operates in contemporary society. His encounters with new forms of authority, evolving social movements, and changing cultural dynamics have served not to reform his character, but to provide him with fresh opportunities to demonstrate the enduring relevance of his particular form of evil genius. The introduction of PC Principal to South Park Elementary marked a significant shift in the institutional landscape that Eric had learned to navigate with such devastating effectiveness. Here was an authority figure who could not be manipulated through traditional means, someone whose commitment to progressive ideals created an entirely new set of rules and expectations that Eric's established techniques seemed powerless to circumvent. Rather than being defeated by this challenge, Eric demonstrated his remarkable adaptability by developing entirely new approaches to manipulation that worked within the framework of politically correct discourse. Eric's initial encounters with PC Principal revealed his sophisticated understanding of how new forms of authority operate and where their vulnerabilities might be found. Rather than directly challenging the principal's progressive agenda, Eric learned to position himself as an ally and supporter, using the language of social justice and progressive politics to advance his own selfish agenda, while appearing to embrace the very values that should have protected others from his manipulation. This evolution demonstrated that his fundamental nature remained unchanged even as his tactical approaches became more sophisticated. The way Eric navigated the politically correct environment of the school under PC Principal's leadership showcased his remarkable ability to learn new vocabularies and adopt new personas when his established methods proved ineffective. He studied the language of privilege, microaggressions, and social justice with the same calculating precision he had once applied to religious terminology, recognizing that these concepts could be weaponized just as effectively as any previous ideological framework he had exploited. Eric's relationship with PC Principal evolved into a complex dynamic that revealed new dimensions of his manipulative abilities. Rather than seeing the principal as an enemy to be defeated, Eric learned to view him as a resource to be managed and directed. By presenting himself as a reformed individual who had genuinely embraced progressive values, Eric gained access to institutional power that he could redirect toward his own purposes while maintaining the appearance of moral improvement and social consciousness. The introduction of Heidi Turner into Eric's romantic life provided perhaps the most disturbing demonstration of how his manipulative techniques had evolved and intensified over the years. His relationship with Heidi represented not a genuine attempt at romantic connection, but rather his most sophisticated and sustained psychological campaign, a long-term manipulation project that revealed new depths of his capacity for emotional abuse and control. The relationship served as a laboratory where Eric could test and refine techniques of psychological manipulation that went far beyond anything he had previously attempted. Eric's courtship of Heidi began with what appeared to be genuine charm and attention, demonstrating his growing understanding of how to present himself as a desirable partner while concealing his true intentions and character. His initial behavior toward Heidi seemed to represent genuine personal growth and emotional maturation, creating hope among observers that he might finally be developing the capacity for healthy human relationships. This apparent transformation made his subsequent treatment of Heidi all the more shocking and disturbing. The psychological techniques that Eric employed in his relationship with Heidi revealed his sophisticated understanding of how emotional abuse operates in intimate relationships. He alternated between periods of apparent affection and episodes of cruel manipulation, creating the kind of intermittent reinforcement pattern that psychologists recognize as one of the most effective methods for creating psychological dependency and breaking down a victim's sense of self-worth and autonomy. Eric's systematic destruction of Heidi's self-confidence and independent judgment demonstrated his recognition that successful long-term manipulation requires the gradual erosion of the victim's ability to think clearly and make decisions based on their own interests and values. He accomplished this through subtle techniques of gaslighting, reality distortion, and emotional manipulation that left Heidi increasingly dependent on his approval and validation while doubting her own perceptions and judgment. The way Eric used Heidi's genuine care and affection for him as weapons against her revealed new levels of psychological sophistication and cruelty. He learned to interpret her expressions of love and concern as attempts to control or manipulate him, turning her positive emotions into sources of guilt and self-doubt, while positioning himself as the victim of her excessive demands and expectations. This inversion of victim and abuser dynamics demonstrated his mastery of psychological manipulation techniques that many adults never fully understand. Eric's treatment of Heidi during their relationship also revealed his growing understanding of how modern social dynamics and gender politics could be exploited to serve his manipulative purposes. He learned to present himself as a victim of female aggression or unreasonable expectations, while portraying Heidi's reasonable requests for respect and consideration as evidence of her controlling or manipulative nature. This technique allowed him to recruit social support for his abusive behavior, while isolating Heidi from potential sources of help and validation. The eventual breakdown of Eric's relationship with Heidi demonstrated both the ultimate unsustainability of his manipulative approach to human relationships and his remarkable ability to emerge from even devastating personal failures without apparent damage to his core sense of self or his confidence in his manipulative abilities. When the relationship ended, Eric showed no signs of genuine remorse or self-reflection, instead, immediately beginning to rewrite the narrative in ways that positioned him as the victim and Heidi as the true villain of their shared story. Eric's adaptation to changing social media landscapes and digital communication technologies revealed his intuitive understanding of how these new platforms could be leveraged to expand his influence and manipulative reach. He quickly mastered the art of crafting social media personas that served his various agenda while maintaining plausible deniability about his true intentions and character. His online presence became another tool in his expanding arsenal of manipulation techniques. The way Eric navigated evolving discussions around issues like mental health, identity politics, and social justice demonstrated his remarkable ability to co-opt progressive language and concepts for his own purposes, rather than being constrained by new social expectations around sensitivity and inclusivity. Eric learned to use these very concepts as shields against criticism and accountability, while continuing to pursue his selfish agenda under the guise of social consciousness and personal growth. Eric's interactions with newer characters and evolving storylines revealed the consistency of his core psychological patterns, even as the specific contexts and challenges changed around him. Whether he was dealing with gentrification, environmental concerns, or cultural controversies, Eric's fundamental approach remained the same. Identify the power dynamics at play, find ways to position himself advantageously within those dynamics, and exploit the situation for maximum personal gain while minimizing his own risk and accountability. The modern Eric's relationship with technology and digital platforms showcased his intuitive understanding of how these tools could amplify his traditional manipulation techniques and provide new avenues for psychological warfare. He learned to leverage social media algorithms, online communities, and digital communication platforms to spread his influence far beyond his immediate physical environment, while maintaining multiple layers of deniability and protection from consequences. Eric's evolution in response to changing cultural attitudes around bullying, mental health, and child psychology demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of how shifting social norms create new opportunities for manipulation rather than new constraints on his behavior. He learned to present his cruel treatment of others as misunderstood attempts at help or necessary tough love, using contemporary therapeutic language to reframe his abuse as beneficial intervention. The way Eric adapted to increased adult supervision and institutional oversight revealed his growing skill at operating within systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation and abuse that he specializes in. Rather than being deterred by increased surveillance and accountability measures, Eric developed more subtle and sophisticated techniques that allowed him to continue his manipulative activities while avoiding detection or consequences. Eric's relationship with his own reputation and public image evolved to reflect his growing understanding of how modern media cycles and public attention operate. He learned to manage his public persona more strategically, alternating between periods of apparent reform and episodes of obvious misconduct in ways that kept observers off balance and prevented the formation of consistent expectations about his behavior and character. The consistency of Eric's core psychological patterns throughout these various adaptations and evolutions revealed the fundamental stability of his character, despite surface-level changes in his methods and approaches. His essential selfishness, lack of empathy, and commitment to manipulation remained constant, even as the specific techniques he employed became more sophisticated and culturally relevant. Eric's ability to learn and grow intellectually while remaining completely unchanged morally and emotionally represented one of the most disturbing aspects of his character development over the years. His increasing sophistication in manipulation and psychological warfare demonstrated that intelligence and learning capacity can exist completely independently of moral development or emotional growth, creating individuals who become more dangerous rather than more beneficial to society as they accumulate knowledge and experience. The modern Eric serves as a case study in how certain types of personality disorders and psychological dysfunctions can adapt and evolve in response to changing social conditions without any fundamental alteration in their essential character or impact on others. His continued presence in South Park represents both the persistence of certain forms of human evil and their remarkable ability to reinvent themselves in response to new challenges and opportunities. In contemplating Eric's evolution and adaptation over the years, we see reflected not just the development of a fictional character, but broader truths about how manipulation and psychological abuse operate in changing social contexts. His story serves as a reminder that progress in social awareness and institutional protection does not automatically eliminate the threats posed by individuals who are committed to exploitation and harm, but rather creates new challenges that require continued vigilance and understanding to address effectively. As our journey through the twisted landscape of Eric Cartman's psychology draws to a close, we find ourselves confronting uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the human capacity for darkness. Eric serves as more than just an animated character designed for our entertainment. He functions as a mirror that reflects back the shadow aspects of human nature that we prefer to ignore or deny. His exaggerated cruelty and manipulation reveal the seeds of similar impulses that exist within ordinary people. The capacity for selfishness and exploitation that civilization works constantly to contain and channel toward constructive ends. The genius of Eric's character lies not in his complete alienness from normal human experience, but in his recognizable humanity, twisted beyond acceptable boundaries. We see in his manipulations the same psychological techniques that appear in real-world relationships, in his schemes the same patterns of exploitation that characterize genuine criminal enterprises, and in his development the same environmental factors that shape actual personality disorders and antisocial behavior. This recognition makes him both fascinating and deeply unsettling, a cautionary tale about how individual pathology can emerge from seemingly ordinary circumstances. Eric's story ultimately serves as both warning and wisdom, reminding us that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs, but instead emerges gradually through the erosion of empathy, the rationalization of cruelty, and the triumph of self-interest over moral consideration. In understanding his darkness, we better recognize the light that makes human civilization possible, the countless daily choices toward kindness and cooperation that keep our world from descending into the chaos that Eric represents. Rest now in the knowledge that such understanding, however uncomfortable, serves as protection against the very forces it examines. Sleep peacefully, knowing that in recognizing darkness, we strengthen our commitment to the light.